had done two underground films. Well, really three or four, but two long underground films, feature-length ones, Stereo and Crimes of the Future, which I had shot myself and edited myself. They were in 35 millimeter. They had been at some film festivals, the Edinburgh Film Festival, the Adelaide and Auckland Film Festivals, and so on. And I had to decide whether I was going to really make filmmaking my life, my business, the way I earn my living, or not. And I couldn't do it as an underground filmmaker because you didn't make any money as an underground filmmaker. And looking around at the landscape of Canadian filmmaking, there really was only one serious commercial enterprise, and that was Cinepix in Montreal, because otherwise you were making films about fishermen and farmers for the National Film Board, or you were doing small things for the CBC, although the CBC was doing some interesting things, but that was television, of course, and it wasn't movie making. So I decided at a certain point, yes, I wanted to be a professional filmmaker. That would be my life. I gave up the idea of being a novelist, and I thought, I'm going to be a filmmaker. That meant, if I was going to stay in Canada, going to Montreal and engaging with Cinepix, because Cinepix had been a distributor of films and then decided to go into filmmaking, film production, and they had made some very lovely, gentle, softcore porn films that were really were like Valerie, which were also very political in the Quebec manner, and they were not just porn films. They were very funny and very witty, and had a bite to them, a political bite to them. And I thought, these are interesting guys, and so maybe there's something we could do there. Well, I went there. I met John Dunning and Andre Link, the two Cinepix guys, the Cinepixies. And I found them to be really very congenial and very intelligent and very open and very interested. And I showed them Stereo and Crimes of the Future and said, maybe I could direct one of your porn films. And they said, well, we can see from your films that you have a very exquisite sexual sensibility. We're just not sure what kind it is. And because the sexuality in both of those films was kind of very interesting and mixed and omnisexual and whatever. But they gave me a chance to direct a couple of auditions for them. And finally, I showed them my script for Shivers, and I said, this is what I want to do. I'm a horror filmmaker. Obviously, it just seems natural to me. I didn't plan to be, but when I started to write, that's what came up out of the typewriter. And are you interested? And they were very interested because their sex films sold well in Europe, but they couldn't get them to play at all in America. And they knew that Roger Corman type low-budget horror films had a market in America. And they thought, well, this could be a homegrown kind of version of that. And they were very excited about it. And I was very excited that they were. Of course, they didn't exactly necessarily want me as the director because they weren't sure about my underground films, how that style would translate into a commercial, mainstream kind of film. And I think that at a certain point they tried to buy the script from me so that someone else could direct it. And I said, no, if you want the script, you got to take me.
If you think you have a strong stomach, if you feel nothing can shock you, if you say you don't scare easily, if you believe you've seen everything, then prepare yourself for...
But it was not easy to get the film financed because it was a horror film. And there was no tradition in Canadian filmmaking of horror films, or genre films of any kind, in fact. Once again, the tradition was a kind of docudramas that the National Film Board would make from time to time. And so it was quite a struggle to get Telefilm, which then was called the Canadian Film Development Corporation, to invest in Shivers. But finally they did. I mean, I actually went to LA because I despaired of it ever happening. It was obvious that Cinepix really needed financing from the Canadian government in order to make it work. And I went to LA. It was the first time I'd ever been there. Went with Norman Snyder, who was a writer who actually ended up co-writing Dead Ringers with me much later. And we rented a red Mustang convertible, and we drove around, and it was wonderful because it was February and horrible in Toronto, and it was palm trees and sunshine in LA, and it was great. And I took my project around to a lot of places like Roger Corman's filmmaking production house. And they all said, no, we would make this. We love this. This is a great idea. We'll do that. So I came back to Toronto thinking I'm going to have to move to LA, as many others had done. As actually Lorne Michaels, who I knew from Toronto, was in LA, not in New York at that time, doing some comedy specials. By the time I got back to Toronto, though, Cinepix had convinced the Telefilm to invest in Shivers. And so that was a crucial moment, because I would have moved to LA. I would have had to move to LA if it had not been for that moment.
A motion picture that takes you beyond fear, beyond your wildest nightmares.
I felt ultimately that I would have to learn on the job, and that was, as I have said before, the John Dunning and Andre Link School of Filmmaking. They were my film school. And John was my movie father, and I think Andre was a little bit like my movie uncle. John was more involved in the creative side, Andre more on the financing and distribution side. And it was a fabulous time, it really was, because John was incredibly open, very sweet, very gentle, very wise, and very knowing about filmmaking. All the things that as an underground filmmaker you wouldn't have to deal with, that is to say professional actors, professional technicians, because you would do it all yourself and you'd shoot with your friends, you know, and professional editors and so on, and all of that. I mean, I remember my first production meeting, sitting around a table with all of these people who John had placed around me because they were all more experienced than I was, and that was his technique, was, okay, I've got a first-time film director, basically. I will surround him with people who are not first-time crew and heads of department, and they will help him make the movie, and they'll show him how to make the movie. And that's exactly what happened. But I remember sitting there, and there were all these people, production manager and production designer and art director, and I had no idea what they did. I actually didn't know what their function was. Gradually, of course, and I only had 2 weeks to learn, because it was 2 weeks was our shooting schedule for Shivers, $185,000 budget. And then it ended up making $5 million, and was the first film that had ever actually returned the investment of the Canadian Film Development Corporation. But my original title for Shivers was Orgy of the Blood Parasites, because I was ready to really go for it, not hold back. You know, we're making a horror film, let's go for it. At a certain point, they wanted to pull it back to the parasite murders, a little less confrontational maybe. And then ultimately it was called Shivers in Canada, and then in the US they called it They Came From Within. I think perhaps John was and Andre were more relaxed in a weird way about Shivers, because there were more precedents for it. They had their eye not on Canada necessarily, but on the US. And they knew, as I say, from the Corman example and many others, that a film like that could play well in the U.S. So even if we got, you know, censored, somehow blocked from releasing the film in Canada, there were many other outlets for it. So I didn't think they were very nervous about it, you know, except certainly John was very passionate about the films that he made, and he was very passionate about Shivers, even though it was a small film and so on and so on. But that was another thing that was great, is that you weren't considered like some, you know, sort of poor relative because you're making a low-budget horror film there. That was big stuff for them, and you felt like you were doing a major thing, which, of course, for me in my career, it actually was. And so you got you felt very validated and very supported and and there was excitement about it. I'd say excitement more than nervousness. There was always a bit of nervousness. 2 weeks to do a movie which has a lot of special effects and a lot of action that's a challenge. It would be a challenge for me to do that movie now with that kind of schedule.
What are they? Raging demons from another world? bloodthirsty creatures that must be killed, or incarnations of absolute evil.
Famously, Robert Fulford, writing as Marshall Delaney for Saturday Night Magazine, had really crucified Shivers. He on the cover of Saturday Night Magazine had said, "You should know how bad this movie is. You paid for it," meaning the taxpayers and television. Of course, by the time that article came out, we had already repaid the taxpayers and given them a profit. He didn't seem to mention that, but it scared what was to become telefilm, and they were afraid to invest in my next movie, which was Rabid, which was also a horror film. I don't think at that point we had cast Marilyn Chambers, the porno queen, but that would have made them even more nervous. So it actually cost me a couple of years of my filmmaking life, that article by Fulford. He likes to say that it gave me a sort of edgy cachet and is taking all kinds of credit for that. But basically, he screwed me up for a couple of years, actually, because Telefilm was afraid to invest in my film. And until Cinepix figured out a way to kind of put 3 movies together as a package and kind of bury Rabid in that, they couldn't really finance the film, even though we were all ready to go with it. So that was, that's the interface you have with the journalists, with the press, with, you do not make films in a vacuum. You don't release them in a vacuum, but you also don't make them and finance them in a vacuum. You have to deal with that. I must say, making Shivers and Rabid the way that they were made gave me incredible strength and endurance and understanding about filmmaking in general and how tough it is. And certainly to that extent, Fulford was right. But I didn't really need his extra little sort of stab of the shiv, to help me along there.
You can't trust your mother, your best friend, the neighbor next door. 1 minute, they're perfectly normal. The next, rabid.
Horror films are eternal. They've always, since the beginning of cinema, they've always been made. They were a literary category as well, and literature and poetic category and poems, and it is something there's something about the human psyche that needs to deal with death in a particular way, and I don't think that will ever go away. So it will express itself one way or another, and I think the means to making subversive, low-budget films that work outside the mainstream, I think that will always be there. I think it's always been there.